She was alone and invisible at the royal event until the most feared immortal alive whispered, "Pretend to be my queen." Her response left the vampire king and every noble watching speechless. Thank you for sticking around, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked and ready for a tale of dark royalty and secrets, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, another story just as intense as this one is coming your way. Now, let us begin. Alara Moonfall wasn't supposed to be there. She knew at the moment she passed beneath the towering obsidian gates of the Nightborn Palace. She knew it when the vampire sentries checked her invitation twice, their glowing amber eyes lingering on her human pulse. She knew it when a noblewoman draped in midnight silk and blood rubies looked her up and down and simply turned away, as if Alara were nothing more than a shadow on the marble floor. And perhaps she was. The royal convocation gathered the kind of beings who appeared in legends and cautionary tales. Ancient lords whose mere presence made the air feel heavier. Duchesses whose beauty was so flawless it seemed carved rather than born. Courtiers whose laughter sounded like breaking glass and whose eyes tracked movement the way predators watched prey. And in the middle of it all was Alara, wearing a simple black gown that felt painfully mortal, shoes that already pinched, and a heart that beat far too loudly in a room full of creatures who could hear it from across the hall. The only reason she was there had a name: Lord Cassius Fern, a distant patron who'd commissioned her archival work and sent the invitation as what he called an educational opportunity. Alara suspected it was more like morbid curiosity. Let's see how long the human lasts. So far, she's lasted 2 hours. Lord Cassius had vanished into the labyrinth of political conversations shortly after they arrived, and Alara was left to fend for herself in a court where being noticed could be as dangerous as being forgotten. The grand hall stretched endlessly before her, all vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers that caught the firelight like trapped stars. Ancient banners bearing house sigils hung from iron chains, their colors deep as dried blood. 3 months ago, Alara's life had made sense. She had her work at the archives, meticulously cataloging forgotten texts and piecing together fragments of history most scholars ignored. She had her small cottage on the edge of the human quarter, surrounded by books and plants that didn't judge her. She had a quiet, predictable existence. She had because 3 months ago, Alara discovered something she wasn't supposed to find. Records buried so deep they'd been officially erased. Fragments of an ancient covenant between vampires and humans, agreements that suggested the throne had once been shared, not conquered. She'd reported her findings to Lord Cassius, thinking it was just another historical curiosity. She hadn't expected the fear in his eyes when he read them, or the way he'd made her swear never to speak of it again. Alara took a slow breath, pushing the memory away. Stay for the minimum time required. Don't draw attention. Go home and pretend this never happened. A solid plan. Reasonable. Safe. She found a position near one of the massive windows overlooking moonlit gardens where bone-white flowers bloomed only in darkness. From there, she could observe without participating, the perfect strategy for survival. She'd watch the political theater unfold, mentally catalog the power dynamics, and then disappear the moment it was acceptable to leave. A perfect plan, until the moment it shattered completely. On the other side of the hall, King Valor Nightborn didn't want to be there either. The difference was that Valor never had a choice. When you were the vampire king, ancient, absolute, and bound by traditions older than most civilizations, royal convocations weren't optional. They were battlegrounds disguised as celebrations, where every smile concealed a blade and every toast carried the weight of alliance or threat. Over 3 centuries old, Valor had built an empire in control. Ruthless when necessary, strategic always. The kind of ruler who entered a room and silence followed like a trained hound. Not because he demanded it, but because his very presence reminded everyone exactly how fragile their immortality truly was. But tonight, that control was being tested. The test was 5'8", had hair like spun gold, wore a gown that cost more than most estates, and smiled with the calculated precision of a master chess player. Duchess Morwen Ashcliffe, bloodline purer than winter snow, political connections that spanned continents, and ambition that had been sharpened over 200 years into something that could cut through stone. For the past year, Morwen had positioned herself as the inevitable future queen. Not through courtship, but through strategy. Appearing at his side at every possible function. Ensuring her name appeared in the same breath as his in-court gossip. Letting everyone assume what she'd never actually secured. The problem wasn't just Morwen's persistence. It was the web she'd woven around him. Alliances with other noble houses. Whispered suggestions that a formal union would stabilize the court. Carefully orchestrated moments where rejecting her would appear like political weakness. Valor had made his disinterest clear. Privately, politely, and then less politely. Morwen heard only what served her ambitions. And tonight, with half the immortal elite watching, she seemed especially determined. Valor, her voice cut through the ambient conversation like silk over ice. You've been avoiding the receiving line. I've been circulating Morwen, he replied, tone neutral, gaze scanning the room. As custom requires. Always circulating away from me. She moved closer, her smile never wavering. People are beginning to wonder if you can find my company unpleasant. People wonder about many things. They certainly do. She tilted her head, studying him with eyes that glowed faintly amber. For instance, they're wondering when you'll make a formal announcement. The court needs stability. A united throne would send a very clear message. Valor felt his jaw tighten imperceptibly. He needed to end this conversation. Now. It was then that his eyes swept the hall, searching for any plausible escape, and found something entirely unexpected. A human woman. Alone. Standing by the window like she was trying to become part of the architecture. She wasn't trying to be seen. She wasn't performing for the court. She didn't belong in this world at all. And for that exact reason, she was perfect. Valor made a decision in 3 seconds. It wasn't like him to act without extensive planning, but desperate circumstances required proportional measures. And there was something about her. The way she held herself, the intelligence in her eyes even from across the room, that suggested she might understand. If you'll excuse me, he said to Morwen without waiting for permission, and walked directly toward the human by the window. Alara saw the vampire king approaching, and her first instinct was to check if there was someone behind her. Perhaps a visiting dignitary she'd missed. An emergency exit she was blocking. Anything that would explain why the most powerful immortal in existence was moving through the crowd in her direction. There was nothing. Just her, the window, and the creeping certainty that she'd somehow done something catastrophically wrong. The king stopped beside her. Up close, he was even more overwhelming than legend suggested. Tall, with shoulders that spoke of centuries of combat beneath formal attire that probably cost more than her entire cottage. Silver-white hair that caught the firelight. Eyes that shifted between ice blue and pale gold, depending on the angle. A face that could have been carved from marble. Beautiful in the way avalanches and lightning strikes were beautiful. Dangerous. Absolute. Alara recognized him immediately. Everyone did. King Valor Nightborn, the legend that made other legends nervous. What she couldn't understand was why he was now less than 2 feet away, close enough that she could feel the temperature drop around him. Good evening, he said, his voice low and controlled, with a kind of accent that suggested kingdoms risen and fallen. Your Majesty, Alara replied, managing a slight curtsy despite her heart attempting to break through her ribcage. There was a pause. Valor's gaze flicked back briefly to where Duchess Morwen stood watching with the focused intensity of a hawk spotting prey. And then he leaned down, bringing his face close enough to her ear that his breath, cold as winter wind, brushed against her skin, and whispered, "Pretend to be my queen." Alara stood frozen for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then she turned her face slowly to look at him, one eyebrow rising despite every survival instinct screaming at her to simply obey. "I'm sorry, what?" "My queen," Valor repeated, still in that low, urgent whisper, though his expression remained casual for anyone observing from a distance. Just for tonight. There's a political situation I need to neutralize. Alara looked at him, then at the stunning blonde duchess who continued to watch from across the hall with barely concealed fury. Then back at the ancient vampire king who just asked her, a human, an archivist, a nobody, to impersonate royalty. "You're asking me," she said slowly, her voice quiet but sharp, "to pretend to be your queen. Because you can't simply tell a noble woman you're not interested." Valor blinked. That wasn't the reaction he'd anticipated. Most humans would have fainted, fled, or immediately obeyed out of sheer terror. "It's considerably more complex than that," he said. "It seems fairly simple to me." Alara's arms crossed subtly. "Let me see if I understand. You, an immortal king, centuries old, with presumably vast experience in politics, warfare, and ruling an entire realm, need a random human to pretend to be your queen because you can't handle one persistent duchess." When she phrased it that way, it did sound absurd. "That's not entirely accurate," Valor said carefully. "Then what is accurate?" There was something about her. The lack of fear, the directness, the way intelligence sharpened her words, that caught him completely off guard. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned. And he certainly wasn't accustomed to finding it refreshing. "That woman," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving Alara's face, "has spent the past year weaving a narrative that we are inevitable. Every denial strengthens her position. Every public rejection becomes evidence of a complicated courtship. She has allies in half the noble houses. The court is on the brink of instability. I need the narrative to shift. Immediately." Alara studied him for a long moment. She saw calculation in his eyes. Strategy. Desperation is carefully masked as confidence. She also saw something else. Something that made absolutely no sense. He'd chosen her specifically. Not randomly. Not impulsively. "And your brilliant solution," she said slowly, "is to invent a queen." "Yes." "A human queen." "Yes." "Which will cause significantly more instability than one ambitious duchess." Valor's expression shifted slightly. The barest hint of a smile touched his lips. Cold, sharp, and genuine. "Yes," he said. "It will." And in that moment, Alara understood. He wasn't trying to avoid instability. He was trying to create it. To understand why Alara Moonfall didn't immediately refuse the most dangerous proposition of her life, you need to understand what brought her to that palace in the first place. And that story begins 3 months earlier, in the depths of the archives, when her fingers brushed against a document that should have never existed. Alara had approximately 4 seconds to decide whether she was brave or catastrophically foolish. In the end, she chose neither. She chose curiosity. "One condition," she whispered back, her voice steady despite the electricity crackling through the air between them. "You tell me why you really chose me. Not the convenient human by the window. Me specifically." Something flickered in Valor's ice-blue eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. But before he could answer, he straightened his full height and offered his hand with the kind of deliberate formality that made every conversation in the hall stutter to silence. "Allow me to introduce you properly," he said, his voice carrying now, pitched for the entire court to hear. The effect was instantaneous and total. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the musicians seemed to falter, their instruments producing discordant notes before falling into confused silence. Every immortal eye in the grand hall turned toward them, toward the vampire king and the human woman whose hand he now held as if she were made of something precious rather than breakable. Alara felt the weight of those stares like physical pressure against her skin. Hundreds of years of power and predatory instinct focused on her all at once. Her survival instinct screamed at her to run, to apologize, to disappear into whatever shadow would hide her. Instead, she kept her spine straight and her expression calm, the way she did when handling fragile manuscripts that could crumble at the wrong touch. "My lords and ladies," Valor continued, his tone carrying an edge that made it clear this was not a request for attention but a command for obedience. I present Ilara Moonfall. She will be at my side this evening. The phrasing was deliberate. Not a guest. Not an acquaintance. At his side. The position reserved for consorts, companions, those who held the king's favor and therefore his protection. The shock rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. From across the hall, Duchess Morwen Ashcliffe's perfect composure cracked for exactly half a second, a flash of something cold and furious behind her amber eyes before the mask of aristocratic grace slammed back into place. She adjusted her smile into something that could cut diamond. Beside her, a tall man with midnight black hair and features sharp as a blade tilted his head, studying Ilara with the clinical interest of someone identifying a new species of insect. Lord Theron Blackvale, she realized, recognizing him from the heraldic texts she'd catalogued. Master of the Southern Territories, notorious for eliminating political threats before they fully materialized. He was already calculating how dangerous she might become. Your Majesty, an elderly vampire lord said carefully, his tone walking the razor's edge between respect and disbelief. Forgive the inquiry, but we were not aware you had taken a companion. I don't recall requiring the court's awareness for my personal choices, Lord Vesper, Vaylor replied, his voice pleasant in the way winter frost was pleasant. Beautiful and deadly. Lord Vesper bowed immediately. Of course not, Your Majesty. We are simply surprised by such joyous news. Joyous was not the word rippling through the assembled nobility. Shock. Confusion. Calculation. A human at the Vampire King's side wasn't just unexpected, it was unprecedented. It violated every assumption about power, bloodline, and hierarchy that the court had built its entire existence upon. Vaylor's hand remained at the small of Ilara's back, a gesture that appeared protective, but she suspected was more about control. Keeping her close, making sure she didn't bolt. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Smile, he murmured, pitched for her ears alone. You've just become the most interesting person in this room. Lean into it. I didn't agree to this yet, Ilara whispered back. You didn't refuse either. In vampire politics, silence is consent. In human politics, that's coercion. His lips twitched. Welcome to immortal society. The next hour was a masterclass in survival. Ilara learned quickly that vampire court protocol operated on 3 fundamental principles: say less than necessary, reveal nothing through expression, and never, ever show weakness. She was introduced to a succession of nobles whose names sounded like poetry and whose smiles suggested knives hidden in silk. Each one studied her with varying degrees of hostility, curiosity, or predatory interest. Each one spoke in carefully coded language where compliments doubled as threats and questions were traps waiting to spring. How extraordinary that His Majesty found such a unique companion, said Lady Seraphine Darkwater, her tone dripping with false warmth. Tell me, dear, what house do you hail from? Translation. Who are your allies? How powerful is your bloodline? Should I fear or eliminate you? No house of significance, Ilara replied calmly. I'm an archivist. I work with history rather than make it. How humble, Seraphine purred. And temporary, I'm sure. Vaylor's hand tightened infinitesimally against Ilara's back, a warning or reassurance. She couldn't tell which. Duchess Morwen approached with the calculated precision of an apex predator. Up close, she was even more formidable. Beauty weaponized over centuries into something that made mortals weep and immortals wary. Your Majesty, Morwen said, her voice honey over ice. What a delightful surprise. Her gaze slid to Ilara. Though I confess, I didn't realize we were including historical consultants in the convocation guest list now. Ilara is here at my personal invitation, Vaylor said simply. Of course. Morwen's smile never wavered. I simply worry about our human guests' comfort. These events can be so overwhelming for those unaccustomed to our ways. One wrong step, one misunderstood custom, and accidents happen so easily. The threat was barely veiled. I appreciate your concern, Duchess, Ilara said, meeting Morwen's luminous eyes directly, something she suspected most people didn't dare. But I've spent my career handling things far more delicate and dangerous than social customs. I'm sure I'll manage. Something flickered in Morwen's expression.
Surprise.
Irritation. Reluctant respect. How reassuring, she said, before gliding away with lethal grace. It wasn't until the formal announcements concluded and the court dispersed into smaller conversational clusters that Valor steered Alara toward a private alcove beneath one of the ancient tapestries. You survived, he said. Barely. Your Duchess friend wants me dead. She's not my anything. And yes, she does. Alara turned to face him fully. All right. We're alone now. Tell me the truth. Why me? Valor studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You found something 3 months ago. Records of the old covenants. Alara's blood went cold. How do you? I know everything that happens in my realm, Miss Moonfall, including which archivists stumble onto documents that were meant to stay buried forever. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. You have a bloodline connection to the original human signatories, which means your presence here isn't just strategic. It's legitimate in ways that terrify every noble who saw us together tonight. You're using me, Alara said flatly.
Yes.
Just as you're using me, whether you admit it or not. You wanted answers about those records. Now you're standing in the center of the storm they created. He was right. She hated that he was right. Terms, Alara said. If I'm doing this, we do it on my terms. You don't command me. You don't control me. And when this is over, you tell me everything about the covenants. Valor's smile was sharp and genuine. Agreed. They shook hands, his skin cold as marble, hers warm as summer wine. Neither of them realized that across the hall, Lord Theron was already drafting messages to allies beyond the palace walls. By dawn, every vampire court on the continent would know the Nightborn King had chosen a human queen. And the realm would never be the same. The whispers began before Alara even left the palace that night. By morning, they had metastasized into something far more dangerous. Speculation. Alara discovered this 3 days later when she returned for what Valor had called a necessary appearance, which translated to another evening of social warfare disguised as refined conversation. This time, she was ready. Or thought she was. The grand receiving room was smaller than the main hall, but no less intimidating. All dark wood paneling and portraits of long-dead nobles whose painted eyes seemed to track movement. Alara wore a deep burgundy gown that Lord Cassius had mysteriously delivered to her cottage with a note reading only, "Don't embarrass us both." She suspected Valor had arranged it. The dress fit too perfectly to be a coincidence. Miss Moonfall came a syrupy voice the moment she entered. Lady Seraphine materialized from a cluster of nobles like smoke taking form. How delightful that you've returned. We were just discussing mortality. Perhaps you could offer insight from more immediate perspective? The nearby vampires smiled. It wasn't friendly. Mortality is inevitable, Alara replied calmly. Which means we spend less time obsessing over it and more time actually living. Strange concept, I know. Seraphine's smile tightened. How charmingly philosophical. Though I suppose when one's entire existence spans mere decades, philosophy becomes more urgent. Exactly, Alara agreed. We don't have centuries to waste on passive aggression. We get straight to the point. She tilted her head. Was there something you wanted to say to me, Lady Seraphine? Or is this conversation fulfilling some other purpose I'm missing? The temperature in the immediate vicinity dropped several degrees. Several nobles exchanged glances, amused, surprised, calculating. Seraphine's composure cracked slightly. You're very direct. I'm human. We're a practical species. Before Seraphine could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Miss Moonfall, how fascinating to finally meet the woman who has captured His Majesty's attention. Lord Theron Blackveil approached with the measured grace of something that had learned to move silently through centuries of hunting. His midnight hair was pulled back, revealing features that were beautiful in the way surgical instruments were beautiful, precise, sharp, purposeful. Lord Blackveil, Elara acknowledged, sensing immediately that he was far more dangerous than Seraphine's obvious hostility. "I've been learning about you," Theron said conversationally. "Your work in the archives is quite respected, I'm told. Meticulous. Thorough. You have a talent for uncovering things others overlook." The words were complimentary. The subtext was not. "I catalog history," Elara said carefully. "Someone needs to remember what others choose to forget." Indeed. Theron's dark eyes studied her with unnerving intensity. "Though I wonder, doesn't it ever frighten you? Being surrounded by beings who could end your life before you finished a breath? One miscalculated word, one accidental insult, and he snapped his fingers. Gone." Every vampire in earshot had stopped pretending not to listen. Elara felt her heartbeat accelerate but kept her voice steady. "I suppose it would be terrifying if I believed powerful beings automatically use their power against those weaker than themselves. But that would make them no better than common bullies, wouldn't it? And I have to believe that centuries of existence teach better judgment than that." The silence that followed was absolute. Theron's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, perhaps. Reassessment. "His Majesty chose more wisely than some suspected," he said finally, before moving away with the same predatory grace he'd arrived with. The evening devolved into a series of carefully orchestrated humiliations. Duchess Morwen arrived precisely when Elara was navigating a conversation with 3 elder lords who spoke in an archaic dialect she barely understood. Morwen joined seamlessly, translating just slowly enough to make Alara's ignorance obvious while maintaining plausible deniability of any malice. Later, during the formal dinner, Elara was seated between 2 vampires who discussed blood vintages and feeding territories with graphic enthusiasm, watching from the corners of their eyes to see if she'd flinch or flee. She didn't. She listened. She asked questions. "But how do you determine quality?" she inquired. "Is it chemical composition, or more subjective, taste, texture?" The vampire on her left blinked, thrown by genuine curiosity, where he'd expected disgust. "It's both, actually. Age, health, even emotional state affects the flavor profile." "Fascinating. So it's more like wine appreciation than simple consumption." "Precisely." He looked almost pleased. "Very few understand the nuance." Across the table, Morwen's expression hardened. Elara was adapting, learning, surviving not through submission but through intellectual disarmament, asking questions that forced the vampires to explain themselves, to engage with her as more than prey. It was destabilizing in ways they hadn't anticipated. From his position at the head of the table, Vaylor watched it all with increasing fascination. He'd expected Elara to survive through silence or deference. Instead, she was surviving through curiosity, turning their weapons into conversations, their tests into genuine exchanges. She was making them see her as a person rather than a problem. And that was far more dangerous than any political alliance. During a brief respite, Elara escaped to a balcony overlooking moonlit gardens. The cool air felt like mercy against her skin. "You're doing better than I anticipated." She didn't turn. She'd learned to recognize Vaylor's presence, the way temperature dropped, the way silence became somehow heavier. "They're testing me," she said quietly. "Yes." "Morwen is coordinating them." "Also yes." "And you're letting it happen." Vaylor moved beside her, his pale hair catching starlight. "If I intervene every time someone challenges you, you become my pet project. Helpless. Dependent. Is that what you want?" "No," Elara admitted. "But I also don't want to be their entertainment." "You're not entertaining them, Miss Moonfall. You're unnerving them. There's a significant difference." She turned to look at him. "How so?" "They expected you to break or bend. Instead, you're asking them to explain themselves, to justify assumptions they've never had to defend. You're holding up a mirror to centuries of unchallenged tradition." His ice blue eyes met hers. That's not a weakness. That's revolution disguised as conversation. Before Alara could respond, Lord Cassius appeared in the doorway, his expression tight with concern. Your Majesty, Miss Moonfall, you should both see this. He held out a piece of parchment, formal, sealed with wax bearing the Black Veil crest. Valor read it in silence, his expression darkening. What is it? Alara asked. Lord Theron has formally requested access to the royal archives. Specifically, genealogical records dating back to the founding covenants. Valor's jaw tightened. He's investigating your bloodline. The implications settled over Alara like ice water. If Theron discovered her connection to the original human signatories, he could use it either to legitimize her presence or argue she represented an existential threat to vampire sovereignty. What will you do? She asked. Deny the request. For now. Valor's gaze fixed on her. But understand, Miss Moonfall, you've become a mystery the court cannot afford to ignore. They will dig. They will find answers. And when they do, what we've started here will become far more complicated than either of us intended. Alara looked back toward the ballroom, where immortal nobles circulated like predators in elegant clothing, each one now watching her with new intensity. She'd thought she was playing a role in Valor's political theater. She was beginning to realize she'd stumbled onto a stage where the real performance had been waiting centuries for someone like her to arrive. And the audience was already deciding whether she deserved applause or execution. The private councils began by necessity and became something else entirely. Valor summoned Alara to his study 3 nights after Theron's archive request, a room that felt more like a war chamber than an office. Maps covered one wall, showing territories marked in different colors. Political alliances, she realized, and most of them were bleeding into contested zones. You wanted to know why I chose you, Valor said without preamble, gesturing to the maps. This is why. Alara studied the markings. Red indicated open hostility. Yellow showed wavering loyalty. Green, there was precious little green. The court is fracturing, she said quietly. The court has been fracturing for decades. What you're seeing is the moment before collapse. Valor moved to stand beside her, his presence overwhelming in the confined space. 3 major houses are positioning for succession. 5 more are negotiating alliances behind my back. And Duchess Morwen has convinced half the nobility that a united throne under traditional bloodlines is the only path to stability. Meaning her on the throne beside you. Meaning her controlling the throne through me, yes. His expression was carved ice. I needed to disrupt that narrative completely. A human queen doesn't just challenge Morwen's ambitions, it challenges every assumption the court has built its power structure upon. Alara turned to face him fully. So, you're willing to risk civil war to avoid a political marriage? I'm willing to risk civil war to prevent the throne from becoming a puppet seat controlled by noble houses who see rule as a game of bloodlines rather than leadership. His ice-blue eyes locked onto hers. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, you're using fear to maintain control just like they would. Different methods, same foundation. The temperature in the room dropped. Valor didn't move, but the air itself seemed to tighten around them. For a long moment, Alara wondered if she'd finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, cold and razor-sharp but genuine. No one has said that to me in over a century. Maybe they should have, Alara replied, refusing to back down. Fear keeps people obedient. It doesn't make them loyal. The moment something they fear more comes along, they'll turn on you. And what would you suggest instead, Miss Moonfall? Ask them nicely to respect the throne. I'd suggest giving them something to believe in beyond their own survival. She moved closer to the maps. You're ancient, powerful, and terrifying, but you're also isolated. Every relationship you have is transactional, built on dominance or political necessity. When was the last time someone stood beside you because they chose to, not because they were afraid not to? The question hung in the air between them. Valor stared at her with an expression she couldn't read. Surprise, perhaps, or something more dangerous? Vulnerability. You did, he said finally, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. At the convocation. You could have refused. Could have fled. Instead, you negotiated. I'm human. We don't have the luxury of perfect choices. We work with what we have. And what do you have now? Alara considered the question carefully. A vampire king who's more afraid than he admits. A court ready to tear itself apart. And, apparently, a bloodline that makes me either a solution or a target. She met his gaze. What I don't have is clarity about which one you actually see me as. Valor was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of centuries. The throne has never been secure, Alara. Not when I took it.
Not in the centuries since.
Every day is a negotiation with violence. Keep it controlled enough to maintain order, but visible enough to prevent challenge. It was the first time he'd used her given name. The intimacy of it shifted something between them. That sounds exhausting, she said softly. It is. He looked back at the maps, his expression unguarded in a way she suspected few people ever witnessed. I never hesitate, Miss Moonfall. Hesitation is weakness, and weakness invites rebellion. But lately, he paused, choosing words with unusual care. I find myself questioning methods I haven't questioned in lifetimes. Because of me? Because of you. The admission settled between them. Part confession, part accusation, entirely unprecedented. Alara realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't just about political strategy anymore. Valor wasn't just using her perspective. He was genuinely listening, considering, changing. The vampire king who never hesitated was hesitating, and he was just as unsettled by it as she was. All right, Alara said finally. If you want my advice, truly want it not just for show, then here it is. Stop trying to control the court through fear alone. Give them something else. Show them the throne can be more than a symbol of dominance. How? Alara smiled slightly. Start by asking that question to someone other than yourself. You have advisors. When was the last time you actually listened to them instead of just commanding them? Valor stared at her. Then, impossibly, he laughed, a sound like winter breaking. You're suggesting I govern through collaboration. I'm suggesting you remember that even immortals need reasons to follow beyond simple survival. He studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Respect, curiosity, and something more dangerous, trust beginning to form where calculation had been. Tell me, he said finally, what would you do? If you were in my position? It wasn't rhetorical. He genuinely wanted to know. And Alara realized with startling clarity that the power dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably. The king was no longer commanding. He was asking. Alara was mid-sentence, explaining a strategy about building alliances through shared interests rather than threats, when Valor's entire body went rigid. His gaze fixed on something beyond her shoulder. The doorway. A servant stood there, ashen-faced despite his immortal complexion, holding a sealed letter. Your Majesty. From Lord Blackveil. He marked it urgent. The temperature plummeted. Valor took the letter, dismissed the servant with a gesture, and read in silence. Alara watched his expression shift from controlled neutrality to something far more dangerous, fury mixed with what might have been fear. What is it? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment, as if recalculating everything. Theron found something. In the genealogical records. Alara's blood went cold. My bloodline. Yes. Valor set the letter down carefully, the way one might handle a blade. He's traced your ancestry back 7 generations. To a woman named Alara Moonfall I. One of the original human signatories of the Nightborn Covenant. The name hit her like a physical blow. 3 months earlier, in the depths of the archives, Alara's fingers had been coated in dust when she found it, a fragment of parchment wedged between tax records from 2 centuries past. The ink was faded but legible, written in a dialect that predated modern common speech. And so the compact is sealed between the Blood Throne and the mortal houses. Neither shall rule alone. The crown shall be shared, the power balanced, lest tyranny consume both immortal and human alike. She'd read it 3 times, her heart racing. A shared throne. Vampires and humans, ruling together. Every history text she'd ever studied claimed the throne had always been immortal. That humans served, survived, or died, but never ruled. This document suggested otherwise. She'd brought it to Lord Cassius, expecting academic interest. Instead, she'd found terror in his eyes. "Where did you find this?" he demanded. "In the back archives, behind." "Burn it." "What?" "Miss Moonfall, I am trying to save your life." "Burn it. Forget you ever saw it. Some histories are buried for good reason." But Alara had already memorized every word. And she'd noticed something else, a name in the margin, written in different ink. A witness or scribe. Alara Moonfall. Her own name, 7 generations removed. The covenant wasn't just an agreement, Valor said, pulling her back to the present. It was a binding, magic woven into blood and stone. The throne was meant to be balanced, immortal power tempered by mortal perspective. Neither could rule absolutely without the other's consent. Then what happened? Alara asked, though she suspected she already knew. A coup. 3 centuries ago, a faction of nobles decided human involvement weakened vampire sovereignty. They assassinated the human co-rulers, destroyed the records, and rewrote history. His jaw tightened. My predecessor was complicit. By the time I inherited the throne, the covenant was legendary.
Myth.
Most believed it never existed at all. But it did.
Yes.
And your bloodline proves it. Valor moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit grounds. If Theron reveals this publicly, you become either the most legitimate claimant to shared rule in 3 centuries, or the greatest threat to vampire supremacy in recorded history. Alara felt the weight of it settling onto her shoulders like a crown made of thorns. Which does the court see me as? Both. Simultaneously. Which makes you impossibly dangerous. A knock interrupted them, sharp, urgent. Lord Cassius entered without waiting for permission, his expression grim. Your Majesty. Duchess, Morwen has called an emergency council. She's demanding answers about the human consort's legitimacy. He glanced at Alara, apology in his eyes. She knows. Theron told her. Of course he did, Valor said coldly. When? The council convenes tomorrow at sunset. Every major house will attend. Cassius hesitated. Your Majesty, if Morwen frames this correctly, she can position Miss Moonfall as either a pretender using ancient claims to usurp vampire rule, or as proof that your judgment is compromised by human manipulation. Either narrative destroys your credibility. Alara's mind raced. What was the Covenant's original purpose? Not just power sharing, there must have been a reason it was bound in magic. Valor turned to look at her, something unreadable in his expression. The Covenant was designed to prevent exactly what's happening now. Concentrated immortal power inevitably leads to stagnation and tyranny. Human perspective, mortality, urgency, innovation was meant to balance it. To keep the throne focused on the realm rather than preservation of privilege. So I'm not a threat, Alara said slowly. I'm a reminder of what they've been trying to erase for 3 centuries.
Yes.
Which makes you the most dangerous person in this palace. The words hung between them. Alara thought of Morwen's calculating smile. Theron's surgical assessment. The way the court watched her like she was a puzzle that needed solving, or a problem requiring elimination. You should have told me, she said quietly. Before all this started, I didn't know the extent of your connection. And by the time I suspected, Valor's voice carried something she'd never heard from him before, uncertainty. I wasn't sure how you'd react. Whether you'd see it as an opportunity or a death sentence. Both, Alara admitted. Just like you said. Outside, she could hear the palace coming alive with nighttime activity, servants moving, nobles gathering, whispers spreading like infection. Somewhere in those corridors, Theron Blackveil was preparing his revelation, and Duchess Morwen was sharpening it into a weapon aimed directly at Alara's throat. "The council tomorrow," Alara said. "What happens if they demand proof? If they want me to publicly renounce any claim to legitimacy?" Vaylor's expression hardened into something ancient and absolute. "Then we'll discover whether the court truly wants stability, or whether they're willing to burn the realm down rather than share power with someone whose blood challenges everything they've built their privilege upon." He met her gaze, and Alara saw the truth there. Tomorrow, she would either become a queen in more than pretense, or she would become a cautionary tale whispered about for the next 3 centuries. And the vampire king who never hesitated had just admitted he didn't know which outcome would prevail. Alara couldn't sleep. The guest chambers Vaylor had assigned her were opulent, silk sheets, carved furniture that was probably older than her entire family line, windows that overlooked gardens where night-blooming flowers released perfume into the darkness. Everything designed for comfort. None of it worked. She'd spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in Vaylor's study. The Covenant.
Her bloodline.
The emergency council that would decide whether she was legitimate or disposable. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep entirely and wrapped herself in a robe, intending to walk the gardens. Movement helped her think. Always had. She'd barely made it halfway down the corridor when she heard voices, low, urgent, coming from one of the private receiving rooms. The door was slightly ajar, candlelight spilling through the gap. She should have kept walking. She didn't. "Cannot be serious about this charade continuing." Duchess Morwen's voice cut through the silence, like sharpened glass. "A human with a Covenant bloodline? You're handing the rebellion everything they need to justify tearing down the throne entirely." "I'm handling it," Vaylor's voice, colder than Alara had ever heard it.
Are you?
"Because from where I stand, you've elevated a political liability into a symbol. Do you understand what the minor houses are already saying? That you've gone soft. That human sentiment has compromised your judgment." A pause, heavy with implication. "That perhaps the throne needs stronger leadership." "Is that a threat, Morwen?" "It's an observation." Fabric rustled. Morwen moving closer, perhaps. "I've supported your rule for 2 centuries, Vaylor. Defend your decisions even when I disagreed with them. But this is madness dressed as strategy." "Then what would you have me do?" The question hung in the air. Alara pressed closer to the wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain they'd hear it. "Use her," Morwen said simply. "You brought her into this game. Use her to draw out the real threats. Let Theron and his allies reveal themselves, thinking they can weaponize her bloodline. Then what? Then you make a choice.
Publicly.
Between ancient covenants that no longer serve us and the stability of immortal rule." Another pause. "Between a human who cannot possibly survive what's coming and a throne that must." Alara felt ice spreading through her chest. "You're suggesting I sacrifice her," Vaylor said flatly. "I'm suggesting you stop pretending this was ever about anything other than political necessity. She was useful. She disrupted my positioning, created chaos among the nobility, and forced the fractious houses to reveal their hands. But her usefulness has an expiration date, Vaylor. And that date is approaching rapidly."
Silence.
The kind that stretched and distorted until Alara couldn't tell if it had been seconds or hours. "The council tomorrow," Morwen continued, her voice softening into something almost sympathetic. "Let them debate her legitimacy. Let them tear apart the Covenant's validity. And when the moment is right, you side with tradition. You acknowledge the alliance was temporary, a strategic move that served its purpose. You thank her for her service and send her home quietly, with enough gold to ensure her silence and comfort for life. And if she refuses to go quietly, then you make it clear she has no choice. You're the vampire king, Vaylor. Act like it." Footsteps approached the door. "I'll see you at the council. And I sincerely hope you remember which side of history you want to be on when the realm is watching." The door opened fully. Alara barely had time to step back into a shadowed alcove as Morwen swept past, her gown trailing behind her like spilled blood in the candlelight.
She didn't see Alara.
But Alara saw her, the satisfied smile, the confidence of someone who believed they'd already won. Alara stood in that alcove for a long time after Morwen disappeared. Her mind played the conversation on repeat, each word sharpening into clarity. Use her. Her usefulness has an expiration date. Send her home quietly. And Valor hadn't refused, hadn't defended her, hadn't said a single word suggesting Morwen was wrong. The realization settled over her like frost. She'd been a tool from the beginning. A disruption. A strategic piece on a board she'd never fully understood she was playing on. You chose me deliberately, Valor had said. You represent something the court fears. He'd never said he chose her because she mattered, because her perspective had value beyond its political utility. He'd chosen her because she was expendable in ways that served his purposes. Alara felt something crack inside her chest, not quite breaking, but fracturing. Trust she'd been building without fully realizing it. The dangerous, foolish belief that maybe, somehow, this arrangement had become something more than mutual exploitation. She'd been wrong. She didn't return to her chambers. Instead, she walked the gardens until dawn began threatening the horizon, until the cold air numbed her skin and her thoughts crystallized into something harder than grief. By the time the sun rose, sending the vampire nobility retreating to their darkened chambers, Alara had made several decisions. She would attend the council. She would face whatever accusations and revelations they threw at her. But she would no longer be silent. No longer be the convenient pawn that could be sacrificed when politically expedient. If the covenant was real, if her bloodline truly carried legitimacy, then she would claim it. Not because Valor wanted her to. Not because it disrupted Morwen's ambitions. But because 3 centuries of humans had been erased from power, from history, from memory. And someone needed to stand in that council chamber and remind the immortal elite that partnership wasn't weakness. It was the entire point. She found Valor in his study an hour before sunset, preparing for the council. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. Alara. I was about to send for you. I heard you last night, she said, her voice calm despite the storm behind it. Your conversation with Morwen. Every word. His face showed nothing, but something shifted in his ice-blue eyes. Calculation. Damage assessment. Then you understand the situation we're in, he said carefully. I understand that you've been planning my exit strategy since the moment this began. That I was always temporary. Useful until I wasn't. She stepped closer, refusing to let herself feel anything beyond clarity. What I don't understand is whether you ever saw me as anything more than a particularly convenient human. Alara. Don't. She held up a hand. I don't need reassurance. I need honesty. For once, just tell me the truth. Was any of this real? The councils, the conversations about changing how you govern, was any of it genuine? Or was I just auditioning for a role that was always going to end with me disappearing? Valor stared at her. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked genuinely uncertain. It was real, he said finally. It became real. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm mortal, expendable, easier to sacrifice than the stability of your throne. Alara's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. I understand perfectly. She turned toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, Your Majesty, you were right about one thing. I do destabilize assumptions. Starting with my own. What does that mean? Alara looked back at him. This ancient, powerful king who'd admitted he was afraid, who'd started questioning centuries of tradition, who'd asked for her advice and then apparently planned to discard her the moment it became inconvenient. It means I'm done pretending to be your queen, she said quietly. Tonight, at the council, I'm going to be something far more dangerous. I'm going to be exactly who I am, human, legitimate, and absolutely finished with being anyone's strategic sacrifice. She left before he could respond. And for the second time in 3 centuries, the vampire king found himself completely uncertain what would happen next. The throne chamber was empty when Alara entered. She'd expected guards, advisors, the usual machinery of royal protocol. Instead, there was only silence, vast and echoing, broken only by her footsteps against ancient stone. And Valor. He stood before the throne itself, not sitting, just standing there as if the seat were something he could no longer bring himself to occupy. The throne was carved from black stone veined with silver, positioned beneath a vaulted ceiling where shadows gathered like witnesses. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning. "The council convenes in less than an hour." "I know." Alara's voice carried through the emptiness. "That's why I came. Because once we walk into that chamber, everything becomes performance again. Strategy. Political theater. And I need to know the truth before I decide whether to play my part or burn the stage down entirely." That made him turn. His expression was carefully controlled, but she'd learned to read the micro-fractures in his composure. The slight tension in his jaw. The way his eyes held hers a moment too long before responding. "What truth do you want?" he asked. "All of it." Alara moved closer, each step deliberate. No more careful phrasing. No more strategic omissions. "I want to know from the very beginning what I actually was to you. Not what I became. What I was." The silence stretched. "A disruption," Valor said finally. "A tactical chaos element I could deploy against Morwen's consolidation of power. Someone unexpected enough to fracture the court's certainty, human enough to be seen as temporary, intelligent enough to survive the initial attention." His voice was flat, clinical. "You were a calculated risk with acceptable potential losses." The words landed like blows, even though Alara had expected them. "And the Covenant bloodline?" she asked. "When did you know?" "I suspected from the beginning. The records Lord Cassius tried to hide, I had them watched. When you found the Covenant fragments, I knew who you had to be. The Moonfall line was thought extinct. Discovering you weren't."
He paused.
"It made you perfect. Not just disruptive, but potentially legitimate. A weapon I could aim at the nobility's assumptions about rightful rule." "A weapon," Alara repeated softly. "Is that still what you see when you look at me?"
"No."
The answer came too quickly, too raw. Valor's carefully maintained control cracked visibly. He moved toward her, then stopped himself, as if uncertain of the territory between them. "No," he said again, quieter. "Somewhere between the convocation and now, you stopped being a strategy and became something I didn't account for. Someone who challenged me not through defiance, but through genuinely making me question choices I'd never questioned before." His ice-blue eyes held hers with unsettling intensity. "You became the only person in 3 centuries to make me hesitate. To make me doubt whether the way I've ruled is the only way to rule. Then why didn't you tell Morwen that last night?" Alara demanded. "Why did you let her talk about sacrificing me like I was a chess piece you could remove from the board when convenient?" "Because I was afraid," Valor admitted, and the words seemed to cost him something fundamental. "Afraid that if I revealed how much your perspective has actually changed my thinking, she'd realize you're not a temporary disruption. You're a permanent threat to everything the old guard has built. And they would eliminate you before the council even convened. So, you protected me by pretending to agree with her." "Yes." "By letting me think you'd betray me." "Yes." His expression fractured further. "I thought if you believed I would sacrifice you, you'd protect yourself. Fight back. Refuse to be a pawn. Which is exactly what you're doing now." Alara stared at him, anger and understanding warring in her chest. "You manipulated me into finding my own strength by making me think you'd abandon me. It was the only way I could see to save you while maintaining the political position we need for tonight's council. That's not protection, Valor. That's control wrapped in different clothing." She stepped closer, close enough to see the centuries of isolation in his eyes. "You're so accustomed to strategy that you forgot how to just be honest. To just say, I don't want you to die, and I don't know how to prevent it without losing everything. I'm a king. I can't afford that kind of honesty. Then you can't afford me." Alara's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Because I won't be another relationship built on transaction and manipulation. Not anymore." If we're doing this, if I'm walking into that council chamber and claiming legitimacy that could get me killed, then it needs to be a partnership. Real partnership. Not you protecting me through schemes I'm not privy to. Not you making decisions about my life without consulting me. You're asking me to share power. I'm asking you to remember what the covenant was actually about. Balance.
Partnership.
Neither ruling alone. She held his gaze. Can you do that? Actually share control with someone? Or are 3 centuries of absolute authority too deeply carved into who you are? The question hung between them like a blade, suspended by thread. Valor was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every year he'd ruled alone. I don't know, he admitted. I've been alone at the top for so long that I don't remember what it feels like to have someone beside me rather than below me. But he paused, something vulnerable breaking through the ancient ice. I find that I want to learn.
With you.
If you'll risk it. It wasn't a declaration of love or eternal devotion. It was something more fragile and more honest. Admission of inadequacy. Willingness to change. The kind of vulnerability that could destroy a king if offered to the wrong person. Alara felt her anger softening, not into forgiveness, but into understanding. Terms, she said. If we're doing this together, name them. You don't make decisions about my safety without consulting me. You don't use me as a strategic element without my knowledge. And you stop trying to protect me by manipulating me. If there's danger, you tell me directly. Let me choose how to face it. Agreed. And when we walk into that council chamber, we present a united front. Not king and consort. Not immortal and human. Partners who are reclaiming what the covenant was always meant to be. Valor studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. The carefully maintained distance dissolved, replaced by something raw and uncertain and real. You're not asking to pretend to be my queen anymore, he said quietly. You're asking to actually be one. I'm asking to be your equal. There's a difference. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until Alara could feel the cold radiating from his skin, could see the centuries of loneliness behind his eyes. I may disappoint you, he said. I've spent too long ruling through fear and calculation. Old habits. We'll fight against new ones. I know. Alara met his gaze steadily. But at least we'll be fighting them together. Honestly. No more games between us, even if we have to play them with everyone else. No more games, Valor agreed. Between us. He offered his hand, not as a king extending favor, but as an equal offering partnership. Alara took it. His skin was cold as winter stone. Hers was warm as summer dawn. Together, they felt balanced. Outside, the sun began its final descent toward the horizon. In less than an hour, the emergency council would convene. Theron would present his evidence. Morwen would demand answers. And Alara Moonfall, human archivist, covenant descendant, accidental revolutionary, would walk into that chamber not as a pawn or a weapon or a temporary strategy, but as exactly what terrified the immortal elite most, a human who refused to be erased from power a second time. The game was ending. The real fight was about to begin. The council chamber was designed for intimidation. Circular, with a throne elevated at the center and tiered seating rising around it like an amphitheater. Every major house had sent representatives, lords and ladies whose combined age exceeded millennia, whose power could reshape territories, whose judgment could end bloodlines. They filled the chamber completely. A sea of immortal faces, glowing eyes, predatory stillness. All of them are waiting. Alara stood beside Valor at the chamber's entrance, her hand still in his from their conversation in the throne room. She could feel eyes tracking the gesture, noting it, calculating what it meant. Last chance to change your mind, Valor murmured. Not a chance, Alara whispered back. They entered together. The chamber fell into absolute silence, the kind that felt like physical pressure. Every conversation stopped mid-word. Every movement froze. The entire court watched as Alara Moonfall, human archivist, walked beside the vampire king toward the throne as if she belonged there. Duchess Morwen sat in the frontier, her expression perfectly composed. But Alara saw the tightness around her eyes, the way her fingers pressed too firmly against the armrest. Beside her, Lord Theron watched with the cold fascination of someone observing an experiment reach its conclusion. Valar didn't sit on the throne. Instead, he stood before it, Alara at his side, facing the assembled court as equals. This emergency council was called to address questions of legitimacy. Valar began, his voice carrying through the chamber with absolute authority. Questions about my companion, Miss Alara Moonfall, and her presence at court. Lord Blackvale, you requested this gathering. Present your evidence. Theron stood with fluid grace. He held a portfolio of documents, old parchment, genealogical records, fragments that looked like they'd been painstakingly reconstructed. Your Majesty, lords and ladies of the court. His voice was smooth, clinical. 3 days ago, I completed research into Miss Moonfall's ancestry. What I discovered is significant. He gestured, and an assistant began distributing copies to the assembled nobles. Alara Moonfall is a direct descendant, 7th generation, of Alara Moonfall I, one of the original human signatories of the Nightborn Covenant. The chamber erupted. Voices overlapped, shock, outrage, confusion. The Covenant was a myth, someone shouted. Human rulers were never legitimate, another voice called. Order. Valar's command cut through the chaos like a blade. Silence returned, but it vibrated with tension. The Covenant, Theron continued, was a binding agreement that granted humans equal authority in governance. Which means, by blood and ancient law, Miss Moonfall has a legitimate claim to power that rivals your Majesty's own. He let that settle. Let the implications spread through the court like poison. This explains much, Morwen said, standing with calculated grace. His Majesty's unusual attachment to a human, the sudden elevation, the breach of protocol. She turned to face the court, playing to them. Either our king has been manipulated by someone using ancient claims to usurp vampire sovereignty, or he has knowingly brought a legitimate threat to our established order into the very heart of power. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the tiers. Either scenario, Morwen continued, demands immediate resolution. For the stability of the realm, for the preservation of our way of life, we must ask. She turned to Valar, her expression carrying false sympathy. Your Majesty, was this human consort always intended to be temporary? A brief disruption to be resolved once it served its purpose? Or have you truly lost sight of what the throne represents? The trap sprung perfectly. Agree she was temporary, and admit to using covenant legitimacy for political theater. Defend her presence, and admit the throne was compromised. Valar opened his mouth to respond. Alara spoke first. I'll answer that, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. The entire court's attention snapped to her. A human, interrupting a royal council. The audacity was breathtaking. Even Valar looked surprised. Alara stepped forward, moving closer to the assembled nobility, her human heartbeat audible in the silence. You're right, Duchess Morwen. I was never meant to be here. When the king approached me at the convocation, it was strategic. Political necessity. A lie designed to disrupt the power dynamics that were strangling this court. She paused, letting the admission settle. Yes, I pretended to be his queen. And yes, it was a deception. Morwen's smile began to form. Victory within reach. But what started as pretense, Alara continued, her voice strengthening, revealed something far more important than court politics. It revealed a truth that's been buried for 3 centuries. She pulled a folded document from her gown, the covenant fragment she'd found months ago, the one Lord Cassius had begged her to burn. The Nightborn Covenant wasn't just about shared rule. It was about survival. The original architects, vampire and human together, understood something you've all forgotten. She looked around the chamber, meeting glowing eyes without flinching. Immortal power without mortal perspective leads to stagnation. Eternity without urgency breeds tyranny. You need us as much as we need you. Not as subjects. Not as cattle. As partners. Ancient history, someone called from the upper tiers. The covenant was dissolved because it was unsustainable. It was dissolved, Elara shot back, because a faction of vampires decided sharing power was beneath them. They murdered the human co-rulers, destroyed the records, and spent 3 centuries pretending partnership was weak. She held up the document. But magic doesn't forget. Blood doesn't lie. And I am living proof that what you tried to erase is still here. Still legitimate. Still demanding to be acknowledged. The chamber's temperature dropped suddenly. Not from Valor. From everywhere. The ancient magic woven into the throne chamber's foundation recognized truth when spoken in the presence of covenant blood. The stone beneath their feet hummed with it. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against every immortal present. Several nobles gasped. Others stood, alarmed. The binding, Lord Cassius whispered from his seat, his eyes wide. It's responding to her. Morwen's composure finally cracked. This is impossible. The covenant magic was broken when you murdered the last human rulers and declared it void. Elara interrupted. Magic doesn't care about your declarations, Duchess. It cares about truth, about balance. And right now, it's reminding every immortal in this chamber what you've spent centuries trying to deny. The humming intensified. Cracks began appearing in the stone. Not destruction, but something else. Ancient script, carved into the foundation centuries ago, suddenly glowing with pale light. Words in the old language, spiraling around the throne itself. Neither shall rule alone. The crown shall be shared. Balance must be maintained. You wanted to know if I have a legitimate claim? Elara's voice carried over the chaos. The throne itself is answering. I am covenant-born. My bloodline signed the original binding. And every attempt to erase that legitimacy was built on murder and lies. She turned to face Morwen and Theron directly. You called this council thinking you'd expose me as a threat. You're right. I am a threat. To every structure of privilege you've built on erased history. To every assumption that vampires alone deserve absolute power. To the very foundation of inequality you've called tradition. Theron's expression had gone cold and calculating. You're suggesting we return to share rule. That we give humans equal authority. I'm suggesting, Elara said, that you stop calling it giving. We had equal authority. You took it, and the realm has been fracturing ever since. She gestured to the glowing script. Even the magic knows it. Morwen stepped forward, her voice sharp with desperation. This is manipulation. She's using ancient bindings to what? Valor's voice cut through like winter wind. He'd remained silent, letting Elara speak, but now he moved to stand beside her. To reveal the truth you'd rather stay buried? To prove that the throne I inherited was built on betrayal. He looked out at the assembled court, his expression ancient and absolute. For 3 centuries, I've ruled through fear and tradition. I maintained power by being untouchable, unchallengeable alone. And in that time, how many houses have fractured? How many territories have descended into chaos? How much energy have we spent fighting each other rather than building anything worth preserving? He took Elara's hand, the gesture visible to every noble present. Elara Moonfall didn't manipulate me. She challenged me, made me question whether absolute power was strength or just comfortable tyranny. And I find... He paused, choosing words that would reshape everything. I find that I agree with her. The chamber erupted again, but this time, not in unified shock. In fracture. Some nobles stood in outrage. Others remained seated, thoughtful. A few, Lord Cassius among them, were nodding slowly, as if a truth long suspected had finally been confirmed. The court was splitting in real time. This is treason, Morwen hissed. No, Valor said coldly. This is evolution. And you can either adapt, or be left behind. He turned to face the throne, still holding Alera's hand. "The covenant stands," he declared. "Alera Moonfall is recognized as a legitimate covenant heir. And from this moment forward, the Nightborn throne returns to its original design, ruled in partnership, balanced by both immortal and mortal perspective." The ancient magic responded with a pulse of light so bright it forced even vampire eyes to adjust. And in that moment, 3 centuries of erasure ended. The pretense was over. The revolution had begun. The light faded slowly, leaving afterimages burned into immortal vision. When the chamber came back into focus, Valor did something no vampire king had done in recorded history. He knelt, not in submission, not in defeat, but beside Alera, at her level, facing the court as equals. The gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled nobility more profound than any magic. Kings didn't kneel. Kings stood above, looked down, commanded from positions of height and power. But Valor knelt beside a human woman, and in doing so, rewrote every assumption about what power looked like. "For 3 centuries," he said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence, "this throne has ruled through dominance, through fear, through the assumption that immortal power alone was sufficient to maintain order." He looked up at the faces surrounding them, some horrified, some curious, all transfixed. "We were wrong." Duchess Morwen stood rigid, her perfect composure finally shattered completely. "You're destroying everything." "I'm rebuilding what was destroyed long before I inherited this throne," Valor interrupted. "The covenant wasn't a weakness. It was wisdom. And every year we've spent denying that truth has brought us closer to the collapse we're witnessing now." He rose, bringing Alera up with him, their hands still joined. "The throne will no longer be ruled by blood alone. Miss Moonfall stands beside me not as ornament or consort, but as equal partner in governance. Human perspective will balance immortal power. Mortality will balance eternity. And those who cannot accept this," his gaze swept the chamber with ancient authority, "are free to leave." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Lord Cassius stood. "I accept the renewed covenant." Several other nobles rose slowly. Not the majority, but enough. Enough to show the court was truly fractured, that this wasn't unanimous rejection. Morwen's expression twisted with fury. "You're all fools. This human will die in decades, and what then? Another human replacement? An endless succession of mortal queens who understand nothing of a mortal existence." "Better that," said an elderly vampire Lord Alera didn't recognize, "than another 3 centuries of stagnation disguised as tradition. At least mortality brings change." Theron hadn't moved. He stood perfectly still, studying Valor and Alera with clinical detachment. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. "You understand this means civil war. Half the houses will never accept human authority. Then we'll face civil war with clear principles rather than hidden fractures," Valor replied. "At least honest conflict can be resolved. Silent rebellion just festers." Theron nodded slowly. "Then I suppose we understand where we stand." He moved toward the exit, several allied nobles following. But before leaving, he paused and looked back at Alera. "You're braver than I anticipated, Miss Moonfall. Or more foolish. History will decide which." The chamber emptied slowly, some nobles departing in outrage, others staying to pledge tentative support, most simply leaving in shocked silence to process what had just occurred. Within an hour, only a handful remained. Lord Cassius, a few elder lords who'd witnessed previous covenant discussions, and several younger nobles who seemed intrigued rather than threatened. "The fallout will be immediate," Cassius said quietly. "Morwen controls significant territories. Theron has alliances across the eastern houses. They'll move against you." "Let them," Valor said. "At least now the battle is visible." The next weeks were chaos carefully managed into structure. Morwen and her loyalists formally withdrew from court, establishing what they called a traditional council in the southern territories. It wasn't quite a rebellion yet, but it was close. a government in waiting, poised to claim legitimacy if Valar's reforms failed. Theron vanished entirely, which somehow felt more dangerous than open opposition. But other changes rippled outward with surprising speed. 3 minor houses immediately pledged support for the renewed covenant, seeing opportunity where the old guard saw threat. Human scholars and advisors began arriving at the palace, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. The grand hall that had felt like a predator's den slowly transformed into something more complex, a place where different perspectives collided, argued, and occasionally found synthesis. Alara discovered that being queen, truly being queen, not performing it, was exponentially harder than pretending. She sat through endless councils about territorial disputes, resource allocation, ancient grievances between houses that predated her entire civilization. She learned vampire law, studied political theory that was old when her ancestors were born, and slowly earned respect not through birthright but through relentless preparation and refusal to be intimidated. Some nobles remained hostile. Others became grudging allies. A few, like young Lady Seraphine, surprisingly, became genuine supporters, intrigued by perspectives they'd never considered. The court adjusted. Slowly. Imperfectly. But I adjusted. 6 weeks after the council, Alara found Valar alone in the throne room long after sunset. He stood before the throne as he had that day she confronted him, staring at it like it was a puzzle that had changed shape. Having second thoughts, she asked softly. He turned, and something in his expression had shifted. The ancient isolation had eased, replaced by something more present. More uncertain, but also more alive. Every day, he admitted. 3 centuries of habit don't disappear because I declared them obsolete. He gestured to the throne. But I find I don't miss ruling alone as much as I thought I would. Alara moved beside him. It's harder, though. Partnership always is.
Yes.
But it's also... He paused, searching for words. Less exhausting. Having someone who questions my assumptions, who sees problems I'm blind to. It's infuriating and invaluable in equal measure. Welcome to collaboration, Alara said with a slight smile. It's terrible and you'll hate it forever. Valar laughed, genuine, warm, nothing like the cold amusement she'd first heard from him. Is that the mortality perspective I'm meant to value? That's the honest perspective. Mortality just makes us more aware of it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Do you regret it? Valar asked finally. That night at the convocation, when I whispered my ridiculous request. If you could go back, knowing everything that would follow. I don't deal in hypotheticals, Alara interrupted. I'm here. You're here. The court is fractured but rebuilding. That's what matters. Practical to the end. One of us has to be. She looked up at him. Besides, I discovered something interesting. What's that? I'm good at this. At governance, at negotiation, at finding solutions between opposing perspectives. I never would have known that if you hadn't made that absurd request. She smiled. So thank you for choosing me when I was alone and invisible, even if your reasons were initially terrible. Valar's expression softened into something that might have been affection, if vampires allowed themselves such vulnerability. My reasons evolved. I noticed. He reached for her hand, a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. His skin was still cold, hers still warm, still balanced. The realm we're building, he said quietly. It won't be perfect. There will be opposition, conflict, perhaps war. Some days it will feel like we're holding back a tide with our bare hands. Probably, Alara agreed. And you're still willing to do this? To rule beside me, knowing the cost. Alara looked at the throne, the seat that had represented absolute power for centuries, now being reshaped into something more complex and more honest. I'm human, Valar. We don't get centuries to perfect things. We work with what we have, try to make it better, and hope what we build outlasts us. She met his ancient eyes, with her mortal ones.
Yes.
I'm willing. Every difficult, frustrating, dangerous day of it. He smiled, Not the cold, calculated expression of a king, but something genuine and warm and entirely his own. Then we'll face it together.
Partnership.
Balance. However imperfectly we manage it. However imperfectly, Elara agreed. They stood together in the throne room as dawn approached, human and vampire, mortal and immortal, two perspectives that had been violently separated for 3 centuries now attempting something revolutionary, genuine partnership. Outside, the realm was changing. Some territories embraced the renewed covenant. Others rejected it. Most waited, uncertain, watching to see if this experiment in shared rule would survive or collapse. But inside that ancient chamber, beneath centuries of history and tradition and carefully maintained power structures, something new was taking root. Not a throne ruled by dominance or fear, or even tradition alone, but a throne built on something far more fragile and far more powerful: the willingness to change. Elara Moonfall had walked into a royal vampire event alone and invisible, expecting nothing more than appetizers and an early escape. Instead, she'd become queen, partner, revolutionary. And when the vampire king had whispered his dangerous request, "Pretend to be my queen," she'd given him an answer that changed everything. Not yes,
No.
but something far more transformative. Only if you're willing to let it be real. The pretense had ended. The partnership remained. And the future, terrifying, uncertain, and entirely unprecedented, stretched before them like an unwritten story waiting for authors brave enough to hold the pen together.